Hey guys, it's Liv here. In today's video, we're going to be ranking every fairy type in competitive. And speaking of fairies, if you guys want to see, tomorrow we're going to be having a fairy type run to the monotype master ball for channel members only. So we're going to plug that today. Channel membership button down below, a few dollars a month. It's supposed to go up today, but sadly I had to delay it because of a lot of internet issues this week, which should hopefully be resolved now. But if you enjoy, of course, and you want to see some more content, like and subscribe, and let me know, what fairy type do you enjoy using the most this generation? For me, honestly, it's probably got to be Sylveon. Sylveon has been such a fun mon to use all generation, and I'm looking forward to seeing what else we can get success-wise out of it. Now, as always, we do have the tierings to go over for anyone new. So let's get started. So the S tier is going to be for the Pokemon essentially that they're still pretty good. This would essentially be like the Arceus caliber of mons. These mons are really good. They might have some drawbacks, but typically you're almost always able to run these pretty guaranteed. The S pluses are mons that you would outright be hurting yourself not running. We actually do have a couple of them this week at the very least for the fairy type tier list, so I want to go over those as well. Before we go over Arceus, but I'm setting Arceus Fairy, of course, as always, we always start off with Arceus and S tier. Really, until we get to normal, it's going to be like the only S tier, so I will definitely take that. But as far as the S pluses go, we do have two. Funny enough, it's not actually about Zacians, it's Zacian and Magearna. Now I'm going over the legends first, because I think that it's really easy to exclaim just why these mons are ranked above Arceus Fairy. Now, Arceus Fairy is an obviously incredible Pokemon, but it's a little bit difficult to use Arceus Fairy, specifically in a meta where a lot of the best fairies are Steel Fairy currently. If we're looking at examples, for example, we do have the Zacian Crown, which is a Steel Fairy type, and it's able to put a lot of pressure on Arceus. Meanwhile, we also have Magearna on the other hand, which while it is a lot slower and doesn't have just the ability to sheer break pretty quickly, we do have Trick Room as well as Calm Mind on this, and then Soul Heart will help snowball a lot of teams. Essentially, when any Pokemon dies, even if it's not something that Magearna KOs, you're able to actually gain a special attack boost, which is kind of broken in doubles. We saw this was already a terrifying option with Dynamax last generation, and I think that Terrastal will be even better on this thing. You could utilize stuff like Terra Electric, for example, to get around Corviknight and other typical Magearna checks. You could use Terra Ground as well to get around a majority of the non-flying steals. You could do a lot of different things that essentially would make Magearna into an absolutely terrifying Pokemon, as if it wasn't already one of the best mons to begin with in VGC. Absolute dumb Pokemon. This will truly, I think, be one of, if not the best Terrastal users. Zacian Crown will still be really good for what it's worth. I am curious to see, I'm pretty sure it's been tested, but I haven't actually looked into it, if Zacian Crown can Terrastal or not. For what it's worth, that might change as time goes on, but I'm curious to see. Even still, I feel like Zacian Crown might not be the best Fast Terra user, but I do kind of want to pull that up on the side at least while I am testing through this at the very least, because I feel like that will change potentially my ranking for this. But if we do test with like a Terra fighting set, can we actually Terrastal this mon? Because I'm going to assume that Zacian Crown can't Terrastal, and the reason why I say this is because the fact that Zacian Crown cannot Dynamax last gen, so I'm going to assume that it cannot, okay, yeah, right, I forgot. It's not possible. I need to try in the Natdex Ubers tier, which means that I don't even think I can test Zacian technically, unless if I pull this up on, am I gonna have to unknown tab? Oh my god, I got it to work. Okay, let me throw the Zacian out real quick, because I am kind of curious if I can even make this work or not. Now, obviously, I'm pretty sure the Arceus can't Terra, but oh, you can Terra this thing. What the fuck? Okay, so Zacian can Terra. That is definitely fairly interesting. I'm going to assume that Arceus can as well. I feel like the Arceus Fairy is one of those types that actually would not want to Terrastal. Typically, this mon is more so used as a blanket defensive check, and while I understand that obviously VGC is never allowed in Arceus, typically it's how it is allowed in at least the singles metagames, and I think that would stick pretty true. It's not like this thing has Judgment or Gleam or anything. This would probably be more so just a really fat mon that would be used for Wisp. Maybe you Terrastal into some sort of non-stab type, but I feel like it'd be most likely, if anything, Steel, just to try and gain a defensive use out of it while then handling checks with Fairy coverage. Regardless, though, you need to at least be this good for the S plus tier, which truthfully no other fairies are going to make it besides one other fairy that we're going to go over today, but it's a lot more ambiguous for what it's worth. Arceus is still obviously, you know, this is a fairly good all-arounder. It's pretty hard to deny a place on a team, but at least there's a lot of other Arceus forms that keep in contention. As far as the other placements from here, we have the A tier, which is going to be for Pokemon you can still fit well on teams, but ultimately they're not necessarily as brain dead as these three. we have the B tier, which are going to be for Pokemon you could still, they're still not bad, but they're not Pokemon you're going to commonly see like in the A tier, and they're not Pokemon that are near mandatory like the S tier, or definitely mandatory like the S plus tier, to where you would actually be losing a spot from not using one of these mons. For what it's worth, while you don't need Magearna and Zacian, you definitely lose out by not having at least one of the two, and it depends on really the archetype. For a Trick Room build, you'd probably need more Magearna, or maybe for a supportive build, but you could even stack both of these. That's just how good they are. The C tier is for more niche stuff. This is where you're going to get into the Pokemon that are meant to counter a specific metagame issue with one of the S's or the S pluses. The D tiers are going to be for YouTuber picks, and the F tiers are going to be for truly bad Pokemon that are noteworthy enough or they're fully evolved. So we're going to start off with Jigglypuff. Noteworthy enough, but at the very least, this is purely because of Friend Guard, actually. It is one of the only Friend Guard Pokemon currently legal. If Clefairy was in the game, this would actually not even make the list today, but it's specifically because of the fact that the only other Friend Guard users are Vivian, Spupa, Mousehold, and Little Cut Pokemon. So because of the fact that Clefairy is not in the game, we're going to mention Jigglypuff. It is essentially, for what it's all intents and purposes, this is meant to fill the role of Clefairy. And it can do it kind of well. For one, you do get stuff like Icy Wind still. You also get Follow Me. Well, no, you don't actually get Follow Me. I thought this thing got Follow Me. Okay, so it's essentially Clefairy without Follow Me, which is kind of bad. But you still get stuff like Thunder Wave support, which could be decent. You can go with Encore Disable. You get dual screens. This thing can kind of do a job, but not really. I'd probably recommend, in all honesty, going for like an Icy Wind Helping Hand, Perish Song, and then some other filler option like Taunt, Protect, Encore Disable. Essentially though, just use Scream Tail. I think despite the fact that that Friend Guard is a pretty good ability, just use Scream Tail. I think it just does the job better. Definite F tier, but I think it's noteworthy enough to mention. It's probably not going to be our worst F tier today, if I'm going to be honest, which might sound psychotic, but it is true. Wigglytuff. In my opinion, this is just a worse Jigglypuff. Wigglytuff isn't exactly that noteworthy of an offensive pick here, and at least Jigglypuff gets Friend Guard. Now, Jigglypuff does, to be fair, have the ability to not have to run a Violate, but in this format, its competitive ability isn't really going to be that useful because a lot of Intimidators will just tear around this thing. On top of that as well, Wigglytuff is too passive offensively. You'd rather just run something like Kilowattrel if you're really going to go with a competitive mon. Even still, I probably just wouldn't recommend it because I think a lot of the better options to take advantage of Intimidate are Defiant users. Stuff like King Gambit or Annihilate. So at that point, why run Wigglytuff? I think the best thing this really does would be offer a Trick Room spot, I guess, with the ability to sponge Ghost Moves from Flutter Mane. But at the same time, why is that mon Wigglytuff? It just has no actual place in this meta. I think Wigglytuff offers enough of the right support options to where if you were doing some sort of like tournament where you had to pick some sort of low budget option, Wigglytuff is kind of usable, but it's not something you would ever really need to actually consider even remotely on the VGC ladder. So F tier. Azumarill. Azumarill gets a solid A tier. This is an incredible Pokemon in Perish Trap. We've seen a lot of more bulky Azumarills actually take the role of this format, but Belladrum is still pretty good. One of the biggest reasons though that Azumarill is not in the S tier actually, despite the fact this is an incredible Perishmon, well actually there's two reasons. For one, Palafin's actually been usurping the role because typically teams with Gothitelle are running now the Perish Song on Flutter Mane or even Screamtail, and then instead insisting on running Palafin as the water type offensive user, which I think works out better in all honesty. Palafin has proven to be an absolute monster for these teams because it can have a little bit less issues with 4 move slot syndrome. Meanwhile, Azumarill, while it is still a pretty potent breaker, it has some very key roles that it does specifically handle better. I think that ultimately its time isn't right now. For what it's worth, when Regulation C hits though, I do think we're actually going to see a surge in Azumarill rising back into relevancy, as this is probably one of the best checks you can really get to Chiyu. Now, I won't act like it's exactly a hard wall to Chiyu, as Chiyu can still tear around it, but I would anticipate maybe some sort of Sap Sipper sets that might take advantage of something like a Terra Grass or Ground, probably Ground in all honesty, or even Dragon potentially. Dragon mostly to resist fire, and also Electric, which if you're running Terra, well, if you're running Sap Sipper Azu, the natural progression, if that is the check to Chiyu, would be Terra Electric to rise, hence the reason for Terra Dragon, because it would wall both the fire and electric and still be neutral to dark. The point being, though, is I do anticipate potential for Sap Sipper Azu to actually be a pretty good option to check Chiyu, while still being a fairly viable amount of Perish teams, because a lot of the Perish teams would have a big Chiyu issue. But ultimately, though, regardless, Palafin still would give that contention anyway. This does still have issues with drum sets as well, because Dondozo is so prevalent, and it would sponge pretty well, as well as stuff like a Moongus, which can put a lot of pressure despite Terra. So Azu's still a pretty potent mon, despite all of the top mons that do pressure it really well, but it is definitely not any sort of hyper meta relevant Pokemon, so we're gonna give it the A tier. Gardevoir gets a B tier. Now this is a pretty interesting pick. Gardevoir has an amazing unique role of checking Dondozo pretty well because of the fact that you do have Trace, and you can also go for stuff like Trick Scarf to lock it in. You have a lot of other good uses out of Scarf as well because you can utilize this to outpace Pokemon like Non-Booster Energy, Flutter Mane, and Bundle. You also do have the Bulkier and Prison Trick Room sets, which can not only utilize Trick Room for your end, but you can also maybe block your opponent from clicking Trick Room if you would prefer to stop them from getting speed control if their team is slower than yours. So Gardevoir actually has some nice merit. You also get some good support like Icy Wind, for example, and Gardevoir's coverage pool is insanely well rounded because of access to moves like Thunderbolt, Moonblast, you have Psychic, you have Energy Ball, you have a lot of different options on Gardevoir, and ultimately I do think that the Trace set is really good. However, Telepathy would have some merit against some Pokemon, especially if you're running a spread user that's running a move like Earthquake or Surf. Ultimately, while Gardevoir is definitely not a great Pokemon overall, this is probably one of the better generations to use it due to the rise in Pokemon like Dondozo and how prevalent they are, as well as how good the coverage set is against a lot of Paradox Mons. So we're going to give Gardevoir the B tier. Now, for a fairy that truly has never had a better generation, and I genuinely do mean never had a better generation than this, we have Florges. Now, Florges truly is on an insane high right now. I would give this thing a B tier. I think people are finally realizing that Florges truly is a viable fairy this generation. With access to Terrestrial being fairly useful for this Pokemon, you can utilize stuff like Terra Steel, Water, etc. You also have the ability, for some reason, a lot of people are running Flower Veil, which I'm going to guess is because of the fact they're pairing this to Terra Grass Mons, which makes sense actually. I can kind of get the logic, but Symbiosis is also pretty useful for passing really strong items to Paradox Booster Energy Pokemon. You could definitely get a really strong lead combination out with something like a Life Orb on Florges next to a Booster Flying Roaring Moon, and then going for Helping Hand boost on top of that after you pass the Life Orb to Roaring Moon after it gains a speed boost from Booster Energy. And you could definitely make that work. You would get the exact same boost Booster Energy attack would have given, but you're also now faster than any non-Booster Energy Pokemon, or like a Scarf, Flutter Mane, and Bundle, I guess. Ultimately though, Florges is still an incredible pick. I think it's a solid mon, and this is definitely one of the better generations for it. But ultimately though, we're going to still give it a B tier. I think there's a bit better Pokemon even in B right now, such as Gardevoir, and we'll probably get into a couple others as well that I think will be a little bit better. But it's definitely noteworthy enough. The Dedenne is F tier. This truthfully is probably the worst Pokemon we're going to go over today. This has actually zero relevancy. The biggest thing that it has going for it is Cheek Pouch, but even still, it is only 101 speed, which isn't that great, especially with how fast this format is leaning. Your best support would be something like a Nuzzle or like a Super Fang, but at that point, why not just run Pachirisu? Despite the fact that this has a little bit of speed on Pachi, at least Pachi has an immunity, which is good. This thing is able to, of course, take advantage of berries and restore more HP that way, sure, but its bulk being 67, 57, 67 is not exactly great enough to really pull this off. So ultimately, Dedenne proves to be a really lackluster Pokemon, and we're going to give it the F tier for sure. Klefki. Klefki is an amazing Pokemon, actually. I think that people have definitely come up on Klefki recently. It proves to be a really strong screen setter, I think, in my opinion, and despite the fact that I think it is a little bit outclassed by stuff like Sableye and Grimmsnarl, I gotta hand it to Klefki. I think it's a really good pick. I think especially in the Ruin Pokemon format, this will have a really strong place as a check to stuff like Chien-Pao, or even stuff like Flutter Mane Chi-Yu cores, because you could potentially Terra Water and have a nice backup check to Chi-Yu when it might naturally try and go for a fire move. This thing also has the nice benefit of being a really good screen setter that can resist Fairy. This is definitely a problem that both Grimmsnarl and also Sableye have, and the fact that Klefki can just naturally resist Fairy does actually give some prevalence in certain cores, especially when we do get into the Ruin format, since those are all 4 dark types, and at best Chi-Yu is neutral and the other 3 are all weak to Fairy. So it's definitely going to be a role that I feel like will become a lot more prevalent in Regulation C, but even still, I think it's good enough in Regulation B to where I gotta give Klefki the B tier. I think it is really good. Carbink. Carbink gets the F tier, but I'm putting it above Dedenne. Solely, well actually, not solely, there's a couple of reasons for this. For one, Carbink has the ability Sturdy and also Clear Body. Now, both of these abilities objectively have more of a place in this meta. Clear Body is great for stopping stat drops, whatever, not really going to make a huge difference, but Sturdy, on the other hand, at least might, being able to at least guarantee a single turn. Now, you might be wondering, what does a Pokemon like Carbink do with that single turn? Well, good question, audience member who is commenting about Carbink, because for some reason they really hate it. It gets options like Trick Room, Dual Screens. I'm not going to act like it has anything good to offer, but at least getting the extra turn to maybe do something is one more thing than Dedenne can do, because most Pokemon will also just OHKO Dedenne. So I'm going to give it the F tier, but at least above Dedenne. Sylveon's up next. Sylveon definitely gets an S tier. It's honestly a really good throat spray option. It's a really strong Pokemon overall, amazing piece for Trick Room teams, and Sylveon, despite the Flutter Mane surge, has still proven to actually be a fairly meta-relevant pick. With stuff like Terra Blast plus the Terra Fire, this is a really strong way to break past common fairy checks like a Moongus, for example, as well as Goldango, especially Goldango because you can also resist the Make It Rain that would provide. However, even outside of Terra, Terra Blast actually offers you a really strong second benefit, which is pre-Terra, you can actually gain a single target fairy attack. Now, I did not realize this, but Terra Blast is actually affected by Pixelate pre-Terra, which is a pretty good thing to note, because this does allow Sylveon some really strong single target options into Pokemon like Roaring Moon, and despite the fact that, of course, the Terra Blast damage isn't much different from Hyper Voice, at least on paper, the fact that Hyper Voice is spread and is weakened, you actually would, in theory, gain a stronger hit by going for a single target Terra Blast than you would by going for spread Hyper Voice. So this does allow Sylveon some nice mind games of, if I'm going to click Hyper Voice, if I'm going to click Terra Blast Fire, or Ground for what it's worth, both are options, or if I'm going to click the non-Terra fairy type Terra Blast, and all three honestly usually have a lot of meta prevalence, and ultimately this helps Sylveon a ton in matchups. You also have some strong support like Yawn, or even the other day actually while doing some practice, I saw Wish in a Sylveon, which is pretty interesting. I think that Yawn is still probably a lot more consistent, but Wish was pretty terrifying, I'm not gonna lie. But ultimately though, definitely a really strong S tier. I think Arceus is still a little bit better, but Sylveon has some merit. I think you can make a case that Sylveon might be a little bit better for the metagame. The biggest reason being is despite the fact that obviously Arceus is a fucking monster, Sylveon does have the nice benefit of being a really strong Trick Room pick while having some good priority with stuff like Quick Attack and Break Sashes. Now it's not to say that Arceus of course doesn't have the extreme speed as priority, but at least Sylveon can make it a stab option, which is valuable against stuff like dragons or especially ghost types that would otherwise be outright immune. And nothing is outright immune to Fairy at least, so that is definitely an edge that it has on Arceus. But obviously Arceus is still a fucking monster, and Fairy is one of the best Arceus types, so I'm going to leave the order like this for now, especially when Arceus doesn't need to Terra for coverage, it just has it, but still both are really good. Now Diancie. Diancie is an interesting pick. I think that Diancie in theory has some merit for matchups, but one of the biggest things going out of its favor is the fact that it's just Carbink with 100 attack, and the coverage isn't exactly great. However, with the Terrestrial, you can get around those weaknesses, stuff like Steel and Rock, Steel and Ground. You could maybe make something like a Terra Ground DNC work pretty well, as you could then use stuff like Diamond Storm and Moonblast or Playa for really strong options. However, what I would probably recommend more than anything would probably be something like a Terra Flying set or like a Terra Water set. These would most likely be used to try and get rid of a lot of your common weaknesses. For example, Terra Flying would get you a neutrality of Steel while also getting you a immunity to ground. Meanwhile, the Terra Water set would get you a resistance to Steel and then also a neutrality to ground at the very least. And then on top of that as well, you would still be weak to grass, sure, which at least flying can be immune to. But water in general is just a pretty good defensive typing, and there's not a lot of grass types that are really running actual stab. So you could have that merit going for you. I'm going to give DNC the D tier solely because I think it's an okay enough Pokemon with Trick Room and Terra, but I will acknowledge that consistency-wise, I think that DNC and Carbink are fairly equal. I just think that DNC will actually be able to have a role in this metagame because of Terra. If this was last gen, I would have probably put them around the same tier for specifically doubles alone. Mimikyu's up next. Mimikyu actually gets a solid A tier. I think Mimikyu's actually a pretty decent Cursemon right now. This is probably one of the best metagames I think Mimikyu's ever had outside of the initial launch in specifically the first Sword and Shield format. I think after that it became pretty garbage. But this is definitely the second best that Mimikyu's ever had in VGC. Sets like Curse, for example, are amazing for mons like Garganacl and Dondozo. I think it's probably one of the best sets you can run on Mimikyu, though I know a lot of people are still running Life Orb Protect 3 attacks. I think that Mimikyu as well has some decent other support with stuff like Trick Room and Will-O-Wisp, which allows, especially in this format, a lot of use for Mimikyu, considering Disguise is essentially is a free built-in Focus Sash. Despite the fact that obviously you can't keep an extra Focus Sash on here, you still get the one guaranteed turn to get off whatever attack you would like. On top of that as well, with Trick Room, it's really valuable for speed control, and Will-O-Wisp is such an appreciated status right now, and it's probably the best status you can go for. So honestly, I gotta give it to Mimikyu. This is probably one of the best metas it's ever had, and I think the second that better Pokemon get introduced, a lot more stuff like Mold Breaker Mons, or just better Steels in general that put pressure on Mimikyu, it's going to severely tank in usage. But for now, in such a Steelless format, I think Mimikyu actually has some strong merit, so I'm gonna give it the A tier. Zacian. Now this might be a bit of a hot take, but I'm actually going to give base Zacian the S tier. This isn't to say that base Zacian is unusable. In fact, I'm only giving it the S tier because of the insane opportunity cost you need to use by running base Zacian over Zacian Crowned. Now, Zacian is still truthfully in its own right an S plus tier Pokemon. It offers enough to a team, but specifically, the one reason that I gave Pokemon, well, so Zacian base is an S plus tier Pokemon if Zacian Crown didn't exist. The only reason that Zacian base is the bottom of S tier is because, one, I cannot justify putting it lower, but two, because if you're running base Zacian, you're giving up such a high benefit to your team by not running Zacian Crowned that it's borderline offensive to your team. Like, this will actually genuinely hurt your team in almost every scenario to run base Zacian over Zacian Crowned. However, Zacian still does have some nice benefits with stuff like, for example, Banded sets and Life Orb sets, to where objectively it is usable enough, and it would be a crime to put a Pokemon with such amazing stats and a pure fairy typing, which is one of the best solo types you can have, in any tier below S. However, I'm putting it at the bottom of S purely because of how big of a cost you are giving to your team. And I do truly mean this. You are actively hurting your team running base Zacian over Crowned. Unless if for some reason the format complex bans it, but this is a VGC tier list, so that's not a thing. So because of that in mind, I'm putting Zacian in the S tier, purely for that. We have Grimmsnarl up next. Grimmsnarl gets an S+, actually. This is one of those mons that, despite the fact that, actually no, this generation, yeah, I'm gonna give it the S+, what the heck. I think that Grimmsnarl, realistically, nope, never mind. I'm going to give it the S tier. I have another Pokemon I'm going to actually give S+ to, but for now, I'm going to give Grimmsnarl S. Grimmsnarl is one of the best support pieces you can have in this just general competitive scene. With dual screens, Parting Shot, you have stuff like Thunder Wave, you have Misty Terrain, Spirit Break. You truly do have it all with Grimm. Now, I will say that Grimmsnarl missing out on S+, truthfully, comes down to actually the Clear Amulet existing. This does actually hurt Grimmsnarl a lot, because Parting Shot last gen was typically one of the best moves Incineroar could run. It was a really strong way to keep cycling Intimidates, and that would actually be very useful for Grimmsnarl to try and cycle out with a Prankster Parting Shot. However, between the fact that Dark-type is outright immune to this move, that would already be bad enough, but at least I can control that. In Closed Sheet, though, this does have a big issue with Clear Amulet, because if your opponent has not revealed Clear Amulet, and you're trying to switch around it, you might attack into a spot with Parting Shot, and be actually forced to stay in an extra turn, which could actually be pretty bad for Grimmsnarl. Albeit, it's not too terrible. You can hard swap, which is why Parting Shot isn't exactly a very useful move on Grimm this generation. But when a move that generally had such good utility for Pokemon is so heavily cut by the possibility of even having to play Schrodinger's Clear Amulet, I think the fact that Grimmsnarl is affected by that, it truly is the one thing keeping it out of S+. Grimm also does have a couple other issues like 4 Moveset Syndrome and the fact that it is a Prankstermon without Tailwind, but I do think that Grimmsnarl's role on teams is so valuable, especially in these really bulky formats, that it's pretty insane to put it anywhere below the top of S tier, so I'm going to give it the S tier for sure. Hatterene, this might be a hot take. I'm actually going to give Hatterene the C tier. Now, I will acknowledge that Hatterene does have a role specifically on Psy Spam teams, but I would argue this is actually the only archetype that Hatterene really truly has actual purpose on. Now, that's not to say that Hatterene has to only be a C tier because of this, but when I think of these other B tiers, Gardevoir I think could fit on any build that just is weak to Dondozo, or any build that might just appreciate a spread Scarfairy. Florges can partner with really any Paradoxmon, and they're so prevalent and there's so many of them that you don't really hurt running this next to any of them. You could typically throw a Life Orb on, and pretty much any Paradoxmon currently will benefit from that besides Screamtail. But if you know specifically you're partnering it with Screamtail, you could throw on a Berry, which also benefits a lot of stuff as well, like Bonnet, for example, and Iron Hands, that while you don't necessarily need to be running a Berry for these Pokemon, and it might not be the very best item to partner, there definitely is still a benefit to be had here. And meanwhile, for Klefki, at the very least, despite the fact that Grimmsnarl is typically the better option, Klefki does have a specific benefit of being ran on very weak teams as a nice option to still fill a similar role to Grimm. Hatterene is really only a Psy Spam partner, and I would argue it's not even a mandatory one. Now, it's not to say that Psy Spam cannot benefit from this. It still is really appreciated to have the very slow, the painfully slow, in fact, Hatterene going for Spread Gleams while being immune to stuff like Shadow Sneak priority and E-Speed priority. But at the same time, though, I feel like that Hatterene's role is almost redundant in comparison to stuff like Armarouge, and despite the fact that it is a really good check to Darks, when one of the best Darks is Kingambit and it's neutral anyway, why not just run Armarouge and go for Terra, get out of your Dark weakness, and then hit it with an Armor Cannon? If it's going for a Terra that's going to resist Armor Cannon, then what's Hatterene really going to do differently? Go for a Terra Fire and Mystical Fire? Go for a Terra Fairy hit and hit as well as something like Expanding Force would hit versus those fires and types? Kind of my logic here. I think the Hatterene's just really redundant. It's not a terrible mod by any means. I think it still has a merit, but it's definitely not as good as it used to be. If this was Generation 8, Hatterene would be an easy A tier. It might even be S tier because of how much this format would have appreciated Hatterene. But I think that without Expanding Force, this truly is a hard pick to justify. If it gets Expanding Force later on, I would totally revise this, put it like the top of A, maybe bottom of S. But for now, it's a C tier. Up next, we have Anamoris. Now, Anamoris is an interesting one. I do think that Anamoris, truthfully, will be one of the best mons in the format. I do not think it will be S+ viable, but I think I would be remiss to put it anywhere lower than the top of S. At least for this form. I think the Therian form, despite still being a really good pick for teams, will be more so a bottom of A tier. The Anamoris Incarnate does benefit a lot from stuff like Contrary, and you could actually make physical sets work really well with this, because you could partner this with moves such as Play Rough, and then also go for the, sadly no Superpower, which is important. Oh no, you do get Superpower. So between Superpower and Play Rough, as well as stuff like Zen Headbutt for poisons, you can maybe throw on Terra Blast as well for coverage, and then start snowballing a lot of opponents because of the fact that you have such a good typing naturally. You have over 100 speed. This is a really good speed for Tailwind. On top of the fact that Contrary also would take advantage of Intimidators coming at you, and even Icy Wind Pokemon potentially. You could switch this in hard on Icy Winders and then get the speed advantage even further. Anamoris definitely would have a fairly decent role in this metagame, and I think I've talked myself into putting it at the bottom of S+, actually. I do think this will be truly a redefining pick for the meta, and it will truly change how teams need to play around this. I'm kind of anticipating actually like a Terra Electric set, or maybe some sort of non-flying Terra, and then partnering it with a Misty Train Pokemon, because I think that getting around the Thunder Wave support, which will probably be the new Premier Wave speed control specifically for this, I think could have some merit. But at the same time though, Anamoris will still be such a dangerous Pokemon to play. I think that ultimately you could even just throw a Lumberry on it and be fine. But I am curious to see how Anamoris ends up running specifically, because I think it has so many ways on paper to actually be a nuisance. Definite S+. Meanwhile, Anamoris Therian has some nice benefit as well, though. For one, Anamoris Therian has the benefit of having an Overcoat, which means it is immune to stuff like Spore, Rage Powder, Sandstorm, Sandstorm damage, because Hail is no longer damaging. On top of this as well, it's a really strong Assault Vest Pokemon. This will probably be an amazing breaker on Trick Room as well. However, at the same time, this is similar to the Zacian versus Zacian Crown argument. I think the opportunity cost on most teams will be enough, but unlike one area that it's different from Zacian is the fact that obviously Zacian is objectively just a really broken Pokemon, even in base. Anamoris isn't necessarily that level. I think it's a fine Pokemon, which is why it's already tiering lower. However, I think the opportunity cost is a lot less, because Trick Room builds at least would appreciate a base Anamoris. So I think that the gap is lower between the forms. However, well, at least let me rephrase, the opportunity cost is a lot less wide between Anamoris Incarnate and Therian. However, at the same time, I think Anamoris and Therian is a lot worse of a Pokemon, so we're going to give it the bottom of A tier. I still expect play from this, and I still even expect a top cut or two from Anamoris Therian, but I think Anamoris Incarnate will actually just be a truly defining meta presence, so I want to give it the S+. Dachshund, definite C tier, bottom of C tier in fact. Fire Immunity is pretty cool, especially with the fact that it does add in +2 Phys Def. This is a pretty solid Terra Fighting user, to be honest, and it does have some pretty niche support. I wouldn't say this is exactly the best Pokemon, but it could make some really niche cases work. It's a pretty okay check to Armorage, especially with like a Terra Dark set plus the Well-Baked Body. You could essentially make this into a really good Armorage wall, and then start going for stuff like Body Press, or even just going for stuff like, for example, I guess Ice Fang could be interesting. I'm not really too sure specifically. You also get some use out of stuff like Yawn and Wish and Roar even potentially. So I'm going to give Dachshund that. I think it actually does have a presence, but ultimately it's a pretty weak presence for sure, especially compared to other fairies. So we're going to give it the C tier. Screamtail. Screamtail's a behemoth. Definite A tier. I think this mon is finally getting appreciation. I'm really glad that Wolf was the person that did well with this, because Wolf not only has obviously the reputation of being just a well-known VGC player, but Wolf's reputation also exceeds VGC as a community, and I think the fact that Wolf himself did really well with this mon should put this mon on the map for a lot of people that might not play VGC as a sweat. Whereas as someone who, you know, was a really hyper competitive in the VGC scene, but was a smaller face, for lack of a better word, were to do well with Screamtail, well, I think a lot of high-level players would have recognized that. I think generally Wolf doing well with it puts this on the map for a lot of people, and just shows that despite the fact this has poor offenses and the fact that it's not like a prankster Pokemon necessarily, you can use this as a really deadly support option. And I do truly mean that. I think this is a really lethal support option for teams with stuff like Encore Disable. You have Perish Trap, of course, like Wolfie did with the Gothitelle tandem. You could make this thing into an absolute behemoth for teams to play against, and I do think that Wolf did a great job of showcasing it. However, I do expect fully that we'll see a lot more top cuts this generation from Screamtail. I think it has a lot to offer, and I think that A tier, if anything, might even be too low for it, specifically at this bottom of A tier. But I do value the consistency. Actually, no, that's a lie. I think a Mimikyu is definitely a little less consistent right now. I think Screamtail has been on the rise. I think Ozzy as well maybe should have been below Mimikyu in hindsight, because I think that Mimikyu is a lot better at its support role, and the Palafin outclassing this is still pretty prevalent. So I'm actually going to put Screamtail at the top of A tier. I do think that we're only going to see Screamtail trending up. With stuff like Terra Steel and Water, these are two amazing Terra types in this Pokemon, and the pre-Terra typing is also incredible. So I'm going to definitely give this thing the A tier. I think it's incredible, but definitely one of the best A tiers we're going to have. Fluttermane's up next, Objective S+. This is truthfully better than Enamoris, at least. It's not Magearna and Zacian good, but it is pretty damn close. The fact that it's typing already is one of the best in the game offensively. It is such a gross type to switch around with Fairy and Ghost. It's like Mimikyu if Mimikyu was really fucking good. But Mimikyu had such a good typing, they had to nerf its stats because it wasn't like some sort of legend class. And I know that technically the Paradox Mons aren't legends, but they're close enough to legends, to be honest. This thing also can take advantage of booster energy, obviously, to boost both the speed, special attack, and technically Spadef, but why would you bother? It's a great option for setting Trick Room, as well as even as a lure for certain Trick Room builds against Tailwind teams. You can use this thing to Terra to essentially beat any check, and while you could technically make that argument for any Pokemon, I truly do mean it with Fluttermane. For one, people obviously started running Terra Fairy a lot of the time. Terra Fairy was the common item because it was a way to boost stab while also removing your weakness to opposing Fluttermane. Then teams adapted to stuff like Terra Fire for Kingambit matchups, Terra Rock for Arcanine matchups, Terra Steel and Grass is just more defensive type things. You can make a lot work for this thing. You can invest in the Fizdef as well, and similarly to how stuff like Pheromosa in the past has invested in defenses, or Cortana has invested in Spadef for Kyogre. You can make it work for a lot of physical hits like Palafin, for example, pre-Terra, or even stuff like Talonflame. So ultimately, Fluttermane, definitely just a really gross offensive fairy. Definite S+ for sure. Iron Valiant. Iron Valiant gets a B tier. It's the bottom B tier. Now, this is an interesting pick in my opinion. I think it's a really strong support piece with stuff like, for example, Wide Guard, Icy Wind. You get some good mixed offenses out of this too, and I think it's a pretty good option as far as just general offense goes. However, at the same time, I think that it's definitely a fairly big opportunity cost in comparison to ones like Fluttermane. And on top of that as well, the fact that Iron Valiant, it's in a pretty awkward spot of being an offensive Pokemon in this generation that has booster energy to boost speed, but it's either too repetitive to mons like Fluttermane, or just going to have a huge speed issue competing with mons like Roaring Moon, Fluttermane, and Iron Bundle. And while it is faster than something like a Screamtail or an Iron Moth especially is probably the best comparison here, the difference being is that Iron Moth already has a built-in way to drop opponent's special defense, which is an important distinction to make. The fact that it can drop its opponent's stats while going for offense is not only valuable to Fluttermane, but it's also valuable to partners, especially when Dondozo is such a great option for offensive Pokemon. And Iron Valiant at least doesn't have that over Iron Moth, which is definitely something. Also, the fact that why run a slower fairy than Fluttermane when I can just run Fluttermane, especially when Fluttermane is also better specially offensive and with a physical set, while it is still potent for sure. At the same time, you do still risk Intimidate that way, and without Clear Amulet, you're kind of fodder for Intimidate, and even still, you're kind of fodder for Burns. Valiant's not bad. I just think it's fairly outclassed this generation is all. Definite B tier. Final one is Tinkaton. Tinkaton definitely gets a B tier. I'm putting it above Valiant, and I'm actually going to also put it above Klefki. I think the Fake Out support is pretty valuable. This thing gets some pretty good options like Assault Vest, Citrus Berry. Tinkaton Hammer is an incredible move, helping with a lot of just general positioning. However, the fact that it can be protected around is pretty annoying to say the least. Knockoff support is great. There's actually not a lot of good knockoff users, and I do think that Tinkaton is truthfully one of the only viable ones in this format. While the only other exception probably would be Masquerada. Otherwise, you're not really running knockoff on stuff like Gallade, for example, or stuff like, well, actually, Wo-Chien will when it is introduced. But the only Pokemon that are actually viably running knockoff right now would be Masquerada. Kind of Valiant, I guess, if you're running a physical set, but why not just run Sneak, Protect, Stabs? You have Hariyama, which is a decent knockoff user. And that's really it. It's just those and Tinkaton. You could technically run knockoff on other Pokemon too that are prevalent. Stuff like Great Tusk can run it, but it doesn't usually run it. Pelipper can run it, but it doesn't usually run it. So it really, like, there's not a lot of viable ones that actually use knockoff. So I do value the fact that at least Tinkaton is a good knockoff user. Fake out support is appreciated. You also do a feint though, which is a great way to stop protects, which is fairly appreciated in Tinkaton, as it does also have Mold Breaker to get around stuff like Frigg's ability for Armor Tail to get around priority. There are some other good feint users, of course. Again, Valiant's another good feint user. But I think the difference being is that Tinkaton's bulk, especially with an Assault Vest, is actually pretty terrifying. And with sets like Terra, Water, and Ground, this is a pretty decent defensive piece. So ultimately, though, that's going to be my tier list. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed the Fairy type rankings. And if you did and you want to see some more content like this, like and subscribe for more. I do some tier list content every Saturday, and I would love to see you guys back here for some more. Shout out to channel members, though, being Josh K Ultra Player, Mia, Zeke0, Matt O'Shea. We have BBat. We have Anna Duper, and then we also have, oh my god, I'm so sorry. I literally was just recording earlier today and I noticed. I'm so sorry to Timo Mueller. I wanted to make sure I got the last name pronounced right though. So with that said though, hopefully you guys enjoy it, and I'll see you guys in tomorrow's video. For channel members, I'm sorry for the delay. I had a lot of internet issues this week. Your video is coming up tomorrow at 7. I'm already at about Great Balls, so I just need to go a little bit higher in the ladder and we'll be good to go. But we'll see you guys then. Peace out, guys.